Hello and welcome to Connect the World. I'm Lynda Kinkade, sitting in for Becky Anderson. Good to have you with us. Well, updating our top story now. 4 days of tributes to the late US President George H.W. Bush are getting underway. You're looking at some pictures now from the funeral home in Houston, Texas, where some family members are now arriving, including one of the late president's sons, Neil Bush. They're making final preparations. And we know George W. Bush, also a former president, will accompany Mr. Bush's body on Special Air Mission 41, which is departing next hour for Washington, where the late president will lie in state in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. The plane is called Air Force One only when a sitting president is on board, so it's been temporarily rebranded in honor of America's 41st president. Well, in just 4 years as US President, Bush Sr. took on some of the toughest issues, both at home and abroad. After becoming America's unofficial ambassador to China in the mid-1970s, he developed an understanding of Chinese government and culture that would later help steer relations through tumultuous times. Our Ivan Watson has more.
George H.W. Bush is being remembered fondly in China. It's perhaps surprising in a communist country in the middle of a trade war with the current U.S. administration.
We're going back now to the funeral home in Houston, Texas, where family members are gathering to remove the casket of the late president. We've just seen some pictures of Sally, the service dog, the president's dog, coming out of the funeral home. And there we have it, the casket of the 41st President of the United States. Let's listen in. Casket is now being removed. It will be going to a special flight, his last flight to Washington, D.C., which has been renamed as Special Air Mission 41, where he'll be departing. He's going to be lying in state for the next few days, where the public will be able to pay their respects before there'll be 2 memorial services on Wednesday in Washington and then on Thursday back in Houston. We've just been seeing some pictures of his family leaving the funeral home, making the final preparations. This, of course, was a president who served for 4 years, but achieved a lot in those 4 years, particularly when it comes to foreign policy. He had been credited with helping with the reunification of Germany and, of course, his work to help end the Cold War. We've got 2 of our correspondents standing by. We've got our Ben Wedeman, who joins us live from Beirut, and also our Pleitgen, who joins us from Moscow. And of course, I want to start with you first, Ben, because this was a president who was considered probably the most credentialed of anyone to enter the White House. He had a pretty impressive resume. He was a former Navy pilot. He was a successful businessman, a UN ambassador, a vice president before becoming president. When it comes to the Middle East, where did he excel and where did he fall short?
Well, Lynda, certainly most credentialed, there's no question about it, and certainly more credentialed than any of his successors. And certainly the high point of his presidency in the Middle East was when he was able to cobble together a large diplomatic, political, and military coalition to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait after Saddam Hussein invaded that country. The ground war only took 100 hours, and he was able to quickly declare a victory. But in the seeds of that victory were the seeds of a disaster which was to come. He kept in place crippling sanctions on Iraq after the Iraqi forces were driven out of Kuwait. Those sanctions killed, according to some estimates, as more than 500,000 Iraqi children, and that led to the continuing deterioration of relations between the United States and Iraq that culminated in 2003 in the invasion of that country, something that President Bush Sr. was very much against in 1991. And of course, we are still living with the bitter harvest of that 2003 invasion under his son. So on the one hand, yes, he was a master of diplomacy, the likes of which the United States has not seen since. But in the Middle East, one's victories today can become defeats in the future, as we've seen with the bitter experience of the people of Iraq after the American invasion and occupation.
Absolutely. Lynda? And just for viewers who are just joining us, we're just looking at some live pictures right now of a procession, the casket of the late President George H.W. Bush, the 41st president, making its way from the funeral home in Houston, Texas, headed to an airbase where he'll make his final flight to Washington, D.C., where he'll lay in state in the rotunda at the Capitol for the next few days, where the public will be able to pay their respects and honour him and his work and his legacy. And then there will be 2 memorial services on Wednesday and Thursday. Of course, we've already been hearing a lot of tributes from around the world, and I want to go to Fred Pleitgen for more on that, because when it comes to the reunification of Germany, he certainly was hailed as the architect of unity, Fred.
Well, the unification of Germany and, if you will, the end of the Cold War also in Europe, and then also, of course, the transformational processes that took place in the Soviet Union later, with the Soviet Union falling apart. Certainly a major role there. And I think, Lynda, that there's 3 things as we're watching this vehicle go down that road that really stand out. I mean, one of the things is that you had 2 countries, the Soviet Union and the United States, that had a lot of nuclear weapons pointed at one another. And then at the same time, it was the Bush administration that understood that the Gorbachev administration could be a partner in a transformational process that they saw coming. It took a lot of insight. It took a very analytical approach to make all that happen, and certainly for cooler heads to prevail. And then the second thing really is understanding these transformational processes that were taking place. I can tell you, Lynda, from my experience, that when the Berlin Wall came down, there were very few people in Germany who believed that Germany would be unified. People thought it would still be 2 countries, one still allied with the Soviet Union and one still allied with the West. It took politicians with a vision like George H.W. Bush, also, of course, like Helmut Kohl, like Mikhail Gorbachev, to understand that these were larger transformational processes that were taking place and that a lot more could be achieved. And then finally, I would say, and this is probably the biggest achievement of all, and that goes to all the leaders that were in power at that time, is making everything happen in a peaceful way. We have to keep in mind this was not just transformational processes that were taking place in Germany. They were taking place all over Europe. There were East Germans fleeing to Hungary, fleeing to the Czech Republic. There were uprisings in other places as well. And we have to keep in mind, Lynda, that there were tens of thousands of Soviet troops that were still on the ground there in Eastern Europe. And certainly managing that process in a peaceful way is something that I think no one in Europe will forget. And where obviously George H.W. Bush played a major role with that cool and analytical approach about how to do things. And on top of that, I think that analytical approach and not gloating about the fact that the Soviet Union was falling apart is something that certainly has gotten him a lot of respect here where I am in Russia as well. I want to read you part of what Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, said after George H.W. passed away. He said, quote, that George H.W. Bush has expressed political wisdom and foresight, strove to make informed decisions even in the most difficult situations. George Bush Sr. has also done a lot to strengthen Russian-American cooperation on the issue of global security. And if we look at relations between Russia and the United States today, that's not necessarily something that you would expect a Russian leader to say about a former American president, Lynda.
Absolutely incredible. Frederick Pleitgen for us in Moscow and Ben Wedeman in Beirut. Good to have you both with us. And for our viewers, we will continue to follow this. You're looking at those live pictures of the casket of the 41st President, George H.W. Bush, making his way from the funeral home in Houston, Texas, to the airbase where he'll fly to Washington and line state ahead of the memorial services in the coming days. We will stay on this story. We're going to take a quick break for now. Stay with us.